You're here at the right place, at the right panel, which is entitled as Democracy in Retreat, More Populism as the New Norm. My name is Goran Buldioski, and I work for Open Society Initiative for Europe out of Budapest, which many will say could become the new European capital of populism, though Péter will disagree with me. He is much stronger in his words. Or rather, I promise you, and they will deliver, quite an exciting panel for a number of reasons. One is because this is a subject that I'm sure you've heard of. This is a subject that I'm sure you've discussed before, but I do hope that you will get at least a couple of insights which are new and you haven't heard before. We got the toughest task because after lunch we know where your blood is. That's certainly not up in the brain, so I'll ask the panelists to be relatively provocative and then to make you also think and then maybe ask questions. Who is on the panel today? You can read in the brochure. I'll just put very short snippets. We have Catherine Fieschi, who actually wrote for The Guardian that Le Pen will not be elected many months before, and in the process, she earned something like, what, 2,500 haters and deniers that telling her that she's wrong. But more importantly, she's also director of a think tank in London, Counterpoint, and they've published a lot of interesting things. I personally recommend for you to read the Recapturing the Reluctant Radical. Edith is a former deputy minister of foreign affairs of Albania, also someone who has dedicated part of her professional life in understanding and promoting Kosovo. She's based in Tirana and now runs a think tank. Péter Krekó is commentator of Hungarian political affairs, but he's also something like a chief conspiracy theorist or a conspiracy theorist in chief. You know, with a PhD on the subject. Not many people have that, but he's really a person. If you wanna learn about the political right in Europe and also about the most prevalent conspiracy theories, as well Hungarian society. And last but not least, Sławomir, who is a quite well-known sociologist and political commentator in his native Poland. He's a founder of Krytyka, Polityczna. In spite of the difficult spelling, I really recommend to check their website. It's quite an interesting thing. If you're lazy to get the Polish spelling, get the English one, Political Critique. And Sławomir also, you know, he has a lot of things you can read in the bio, but one thing that really struck me is that he has been co-writing and he has been acting in a movie or a trilogy which was called And Europe Will Be Stunned. And Europe was stunned in many ways in the last years. I don't know if it was because of your movie or not. Now, okay, let's start. So I promise that we will keep you a bit entertained in addition to the substance. So the first piece of entertainment is a very quick poll, which also our panelists will start. Populism cannot be divorced from a debate on democracy, as I hope everybody will agree. And populism is only one of these words that gives a very strange adjective or connotation to democracy. But I think first, let me check something which is in the room, which is about democracy itself. And I have a very simple question asking you to raise your hand if you agree with the statement. And that is, raise your hand if you live in a country that you consider democratic. So if you live in a democracy, raise your hand. And look around and see how many people live in democracy. Okay, very good. I have another question, and that's about populism, and then you will get the speakers. The question about populism is a bit more layered. It again includes you. We've made a big deal in the rest of Europe about the rise of populist parties. And everybody says, oh, we have 1, 2, 3 or more. Now let me test the feeling also in the room, knowing that there are a lot of people from the Balkans, but not only. So I want to get the people who think that in their country or the country where they live, there is one populist party. So if you think that you have one populist party in your country, raise your hand. And no, okay, there will be 1, 2, and then all of them. Okay, so 1, 2, or all of them. That will be the option. So those who think that there is one populist party in your country. Only one. Those of you who think that there are 2 or 3, let's make it 2 or 3, okay? And those of you who think that all political parties are populist in your country. Okay, good. So, good. Now you got a bit the sense of the room. You see that there are actually a number of people who think that all of their parties are populist. So we have to get to the subject. Catherine, let's start with you. She has been following a lot the happenings what has happened in Great Britain, also France, and a lot of this phenomenon was first witnessed there. So maybe we should start with your introductory remarks.
Great, thank you very much. So I want to make just a few discrete points, and then hopefully these can be up for discussion. I think that one of the things that I want to the first point I want to make connects very well to the question that was just asked about which of the parties that in the country you live in do you consider to be populist, and do you consider to be living in a democracy? As somebody who's had the ideological misfortune, but on the other hand, the good fortune of studying populism for far too long at this point. And I don't look like I'm about to be out of a job yet, to be honest. I think that one of the things that I'm always struck by these days is that everything is labeled populist. And in fact, that there's even a huge confusion between things that are popular and things that are populist. And I think that there's a good reason for that, but that it's still worth saying that, not every popular measure is a populist measure. Not every popular party is a populist party, and we have to be careful about seeing populism everywhere, although there is a fair bit of it, I grant you that. But I think that this goes back, and it's worth saying, and I've said it far too many times, I think, but it is worth saying that actually there is no real populism without democracy, that you need a democratic system. You need the promises of democracy for populism to arise. There's got to be a sense of broken promise. There's got to be a sense of betrayal. And a democratic political system is the system within which and through which promises can be made and promises can be broken. So I think that this is something that, when we think about populism, it's something that we need to keep in mind. There's a very good, wonderful scholar of populism, Margaret Canavan, who once wrote about populism as a shadow cast by democracy. And I think that this is something that's worth bearing in mind. The second point that I want to make, because we were told to be brief, is a point specifically about France and Britain. And I think that the point here connects to what to do and what not to do in the face of populist sentiment, and particularly in the face of the rise of populist parties. And for me, I think there's something very interesting about the case for Brexit and UKIP and the Conservative Party on the one hand in the UK, and also what happened in France around the FN and the presidential elections and then the legislative elections. For me, one of the consequences of the presence of populist parties in political systems is that they tend, obviously, to segment the country into two: the people versus the elite, or even more broadly, the liberal cosmopolitans and the left behinds. There is always this segmentation of two two populations that are rival. There's two ways that people tend to react to this, and more, I think, over the past 10 years, there's been a rallying cry that actually mainstream political parties, both on the left and on the right, should try to adopt more populist tactics, that they should try and speak to the electorate through populist terms. The populists are doing well by keeping it simple, by offering solutions that soi-disant, just cater to irrationality and bare emotions. We should do the same thing. Well, that's what we did in Britain, and that really did not get us very far. The hypersimplification of political sentiment, the hypersimplification of solutions on both sides got us to where we are now. And I would say that even though I'm not about to argue that this is the end of populism in France, far from it, I would say that Macron and his campaign do teach us a lesson about the fact that you can actually win and you can actually do well without talking stupid, without oversimplifying, by keeping a positive project, and by not giving in to this idea that what you have to do is absolutely dumb it down and only appeal to people's fears. It doesn't mean, as I said, that that the problem is gone. And so I would conclude on this, which is my third point, which is I think that, in the aftermath of the Dutch elections about 5-6 months ago, and then in the aftermath of the French elections, there was a sense of, well, maybe, the populist wave has crested, maybe we're going to be okay. Of course not. My view is that we need to stop focusing only on the fortunes of populist political parties, and look at the deeper, broader, and much more significant transformations of politics and of people's political expectations, which have changed fundamentally and unfortunately align very, very well with the promises of immediacy, of directness, and of voice that populist parties instrumentalize. And of course, the evolutions of our political systems, the evolution of our social media, of our media, mean that actually, I think that what we're entering is probably, the golden age of populism, and we're going to have to get a lot more creative than we have so far. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Catherine. Sławomir, you live in Warsaw, and where you follow what's happening there, but also you keep an eye on what's happening in the rest of Europe. What's the take from your angle?
I see that my points that I will try to be very clear on, and I will enumerate them, are a little bit referring to the questions of Goran and are a little bit polemical to what you have said, Catherine, though we know each other a little. The thing is that we used to say that populism is attacking democracy in Poland, in Hungary, in the United States, actually everywhere. But it's actually not exactly democracy that it's under attack, it's more liberalism. And those two traditions, not only theoretically but historically, are quite different traditions. Of course, they are now a joint tradition mostly after Second World War, but there is nothing necessary in this. I would even say that could be quite contingent. Populists, they know how to win elections. They can do it democratically, and usually they do it democratically. Kaczyński fully legitimate one election in Poland, and at least first election won and the second election won by Orban were also honest. Only the third one, there were a lot of gerrymandering in it, and not free media fully and so on, were not fully democratically. But they are able to do it. What they hate and what they really attack and what is really their enemy is a liberal tradition. What means liberalism from this point of view? Independent and free media, independent judiciary, separation of power, constitutional court, like exactly all those independent institutions that populists attack, because independency from them, it's exactly what they are angry on. Like they are taking over institutions, civil society is an adversary for them, NGOs, and they just don't want to have any independent institutions in their country. And this is exactly what they are doing in Poland. It's what they did already in Hungary, unfortunately. And this is why they announced, both Orban and Kaczynski, illiberal democracy. So it's exactly what they wanted to do, okay? Now, my second point is, look, they even try, and they do it quite efficiently, they use democratic discourse against liberal arguments. What they say exactly? They're saying, you don't want us to eliminate separation of power. You don't want us to change the law about media, about judiciary. But come on, we won the election. We have a majority. We are elected, and people wanted us to change, okay? So if you don't agree with us, you're attacking the democratic choice. Okay, and it's quite efficient. It's not easy to argue with this. Of course, then you can explain that democracy is not only about majority, it's about also reserving some rights for minority, and this is like a second part of the definition of democracy, and so on and so on. But actually, it's more complex argument that people can really get, like in most of the media, in the public discourse, and so on and so on. For many people, democracy is who wins the election can change the country. Okay, so this is this is actually quite important, because if we wanna preserve our democracy, we have to like do something with this argument. The third thing is what exactly made them, at least in Poland, so efficient. I would say that what they do in Poland, what Kaczynski did, he took everything what is most attractive from both fascism and socialism. In a sense that as long as he controls the question of refugees, and as long as he launched the largest social transfers in a Polish history, and Polish economy is doing well enough to have the social transfers and still to have a strong budget, strong economy, strong growth, and so on, he will control this country and win any election he wants. And in the same time, he rearranged the political scene. And not only he rearranged political scene, but he arranged the social background behind it, okay? Before, Civic Platform, the party built by Tusk and the largest opposition party today, and Kaczynski party, they had almost the same electorate from the socio-economical point of view, okay? Of course, Kaczynski government was a little bit more religious, but it was not like a huge difference, had a little bit bigger support from the Catholic Church, but it doesn't mean that the Tusk had not. Tusk was also a very conservative politician. For 8 years, they didn't change any law about the cultural values, like, you know, the women's right, the sexual education in school. They even they preserved the right of religion in schools, but they never launched lessons about sexual education. After 7 years, the only thing that they did, of course, I'm not talking about same-sex unions and so on, was nothing like that was for Tusk important. Only in vitro, after 7 years, with the support of 75% of society and 2 other parties, they after being scared for so many years, they launched some programs, okay, but without refundation and so on. So we really had 2 central right parties. Now, because they divided the scene so strongly, and this would be my polemical point with Katrin, politics is always about dichotomies. It's nothing new that, you know, the political scene is divided. The new thing and the horrible thing is that the parties, they do not treat themselves as adversaries, but as the enemies of the country. Okay, for Kaczynski, the opposition is not the regular partner in politics. It's a disaster for Poland. This is like the end of Poland. This is the adversary. This is the enemy that you have to destroy. okay? Not just to win election. This is why he wants to limit the rights of opposition, and he feels legitimate to do it. And this is how the people thinks about it. The people think that Tusk for them is a devil, this guy killed the president in the Smolensk catastrophe together with Putin. Like, this is what the electorate of Kaczynski think, and this is what Kaczynski wants them to think. And for us, the oppositional political commentators, yes, Kaczynski is a disaster for Poland, because it is. He isolated the country in Europe. He wants to change Poland to be from the poster country for the tiger of Europe, for the most successful country in Europe. Now it's the country which is the biggest problem for European Union. It's a shame. It's a disaster for Poland. And in this part of the world, you cannot be nobody. You cannot be not a part of integration, European integration. You cannot be in a good relations with Western Europe, because you're gonna get soon, Russian influence here. For more than 250 years, out of 300, Poland was either not on the map or was controlled by Russia. It was a satellite country. People know it, okay? So for us, Kaczynski is just, the only beneficiary of his policy is Putin. Putin is only the one happy guy about it, at least in this continent. So my last point would be that if you wanna do something like with this, if you wanna be successful in opposing Kaczynski, you have to do two things. Somehow neutralize the question of refugees. You cannot just think in a moral sense about it. You cannot meet all the moral expectations in the same time not meeting any election criterion, because you're gonna be very moral, but you're not gonna have liberal democracy nor refugees in your country, okay? And the second thing, you have to somehow overbid populists in the social arguments. And at least in Poland, with this economy that we have now, can easily, overbid Kaczynski also in the question of social transfers. The only problem is that people will always ask you, you could do it. Tusk government could do it for so many years, and they did not. This is actually how Kaczynski could prove his conspiracy theory, because he had a conspiracy theory. The government can give you the money. The state is rich. They don't give you because they either stole it or they are bad people, they don't want to give it to you. I will come and I will do it. He came, he did it, okay? So actually, his populist conspiracy theory appeared to be, quite true, at least for the people, okay? Kaczynski changes his mind all the time. 10 years ago, he was hard neoliberal. He wanted to have flat tax. Now he's he was even anti-clerical 10 years ago. Now he is, pro-clerical. He's very religious politician, very socialist in the same time. So it's not about his real idealism that would like to, be helpful so much to the people. No, he's just a very efficient populist from this point of view. But he's efficient as long as he has these two questions under control, refugees and social transfers.
Thanks. Thanks, Sławomir. I mean, speaking about opportunists, Péter, probably, it's your turn now to talk about the other opportunists of Europe, Viktor Orban. But let me throw a question. Do you feel, living in Budapest, that we are deprived of the liberal or of the democracy? What do you feel more deprived of as living in Budapest today?
Very good question. And yeah, I think, Viktor Orban pretty much agree, with the argument that the liberalism and democracy is something too different, because his main argument is that what's going on in Hungary is that there is an illiberal democracy being built up, under which he means that it's democracy should not be always liberal. and it can build on, let's say, national basis as well. But the problem with that is that I don't think that democracy in the current sense, if we take into consideration even, let's say, the more elitist element of democracy, the institutions can exist without the liberal minimum. And practically what's happening in Hungary is the undermining the liberal minimum, which manifests finally into a really deteriorating democratic standard. And the thing is that I have not raised my hand when you asked me if I live in a democracy or not. Even 2 years ago, I would have raised my hands. But right now, what's going on, destroying the institutional checks and balances against the governmental and parliamentary power are so quick and so powerful, and especially as we approach the elections next year. For example, practically no opposition parties can put out any billboards because the governmental agencies take them down. I think we are heading to an elections. The previous election was not, I would say that it was not fair but free. The next one, I'm afraid, the freeness will be questioned seriously as well. So it's a very quick process, and I think it raises serious question marks about the potency of the European Union to be able to put their member states under pressure and keep them on a democratic path. In Hungary, we can say that it's not a democracy anymore, it's a hybrid regime anymore. It's a very soft hybrid regime, but it's more a hybrid regime than a democracy, and built on illiberal rhetorics and illiberal policies. Also, a few years ago, the situation in Hungary was that there was a populist party, Fidesz, and there was a radical, or I would say extreme right party, Jobbik, that was strongly anti-Semitic, strongly anti-Roma, and even irredentist and so on. Right now, because of a very bizarre parallel tendency, practically Fidesz and Jobbik have traded places. So Fidesz have went more to the right, more to the liberal, more to the radical direction, and especially after the refugee crisis, practically it became a genuine far-right party. Not just I'm saying that, leading scholars of populism and radicalism telling the same. Kasmudde says, for example, that Fidesz fulfills all the three criteria of far-right parties, populist, radical right parties, as he called them: populism, authoritarianism, and nativism. Nativism is the politics that puts in the center of ideology the native people, the people who are living, the Hungarians in our case. And since the refugee crisis, practically 95% of governmental rhetorics is about refugees, that they should not come to our country. Not that less should come, zero should come. Also about that George Soros is organizing a big conspiracy using the European Commission as puppets to flood refugees in Europe, because European Commission and George Soros want to destroy the nation states and want to make Hungary and Europe practically Eurabia, so a Muslim continent. So conspiracy theories of this extreme, it was even unimaginable, I think, 3 years ago in Hungary, but it's a really quick process. And right now, I would say that Hungary have become a country where populism, I think, practically, as a word, lost its meaning. Right now, there is Jobbik, the previous far-right party, that is shifting more and more towards the center. The leader of Jobbik has a role model, Alexander Vučić, and he says that he wants to do something similar, and he did, coming from quite a radical political position, going towards the center and be the pro-European party in a country where the government uses so blatant anti-European rhetoric that some, I think, Nigel Farage sometimes could be envious about. And I would raise 3 points where I feel, just to give you an indication of what's going on these days in Hungary, where I would say that Serbia performs far better in terms of democratic standards than Hungary. First of all, as I've heard a few years ago, I've seen the program as well, there was a big conference of NGOs dealing with the refugee issue here in Belgrade, all around the region. Who opened this conference? Alexander Vučić. In Hungary, the NGOs who are dealing with the refugees are treated as traitors, as labeled as terrorists, and recently a pro-governmental commentator told it in a government-controlled media outlet that practically it's a war period, and in this period, these traitors, these people smugglers can be shut down without any jurisdiction. And he is a consultant in the Budapest Council, and he was not even expelled from this position. So the radicalization of the Hungarian political discourse is quite extreme. I know that George Soros has at least an ambivalent reputation in Serbia as well, but I have not seen campaigns where you can step up to the tram and step on the face of George Soros, because in a big advertisement campaign against George Soros, there was some even billboards put on the floor of the trams and so on. So one point. Second point, I would totally, it would be really hard to imagine that Fidesz would delegate in any leading positions, not to prime minister, a gay person, because it's like the attitude of the Hungarian government is far more conservative, I would say, than even the mainstream parties in the Western Balkans, that is traditionally a much more conservative region towards gay people, gay marriage, and things like that. And sometimes the statements, especially in the Pride days, are just horrible about gay people. And yeah, the last thing I would say is the attitude towards the European Union. So while in Serbia, I know that yeah, the attitude of the European Union is not as bright as it used to be beforehand, but I pretty much feel from an outsider perspective that there is rather a strengthening political consent in Serbia about joining the European Union. And if there is one thing in which I'm totally with the Hungarian government, is that the Western Balkan countries should join, and they try to provide some help to the Serbian government as well. It's a question how useful it is, but they took it seriously, that they want Western Balkans countries, and especially Serbia, to join and provide some help. But at the same time, the rhetoric that the Hungarian government uses against the European Union is sometimes, as I said, worse than most Eurosceptic, Euro-reject parties use in the Western Union. So blaming Brussels with the West conspiracy against the Hungarian nation and painting it as the real enemy of Hungarians is an everyday thing, and the lucky thing in Hungary is that the European Union still keeps its popularity, but of course it makes some damage done. And one lesson to learn from the Hungarian example for Serbia, I would say, is that in Hungary, for example, there was a quite important democratic development until we joined the European Union, because the European Union is usually good in raising democratic standards for associate and candidate countries, but it is really bad when it comes to member states. They usually do not so much, and what they do is too little, too late in the case of Hungary these days, but I would say even in the case of Poland, probably. So I think you should be really afraid about the future of your democracy when you join the European Union, because before that, the democratic development is more granted than after that. After 2004, and the socialist governments in Hungary had some role in that as well, there was a really spectacular decline of democratic institutions and democratic norms, and unfortunately it resulted in a situation when populism, as I said, lost its meaning. It's an euphemism.
Thanks, Péter. And yeah, but by no means I influence him as coming from the Balkans. I was joking with my Central European friend that I already came very well equipped to deal with this environment, because in the Balkan countries before where I worked, you know, we saw similar, if not even worse developments.
Totally disagree with this. Like me both and Catherine. Like
you will get
not
you
at
will
all.
get,
Not at
you
all.
will get the floor. Let me get first to Edith with her opening remarks, and as you can see, you know, I promise you certain excitement. There you go. You'll get it. Edith, how is all that looked from the Balkan perspective? As I said before here, we said, oh, we only breed populists. You saw how many hands were there in the audience when said that everybody is populist. How does that look from your perspective?
Now, first of all, listening to the last two speakers, I would say, do you guys need a hand? Because from this part of the world, which is very close to your border, is not that bad news as you're describing in Hungary and Poland, actually. Although it is bad news, but not as bad as you are suggesting. So saying this, I would disagree slightly with Sławomir. Not disagree, but actually when I put it in the context of the region of the Balkans, I would say that the reason for a rise of populism, it is definitely a decline in democratic values, or not actually decline, because it did not have democratic values per se, but a dysfunctioning democracy that normally rules throughout the region. Now, to me, populism, it is a political identity. And a political identity that expresses itself in different ways. And one of them, of course, it is also anti-pluralism at one point. And what you described earlier, it comes to that as well. The other one, it is, of course, when we put it in the context of the Balkans, it is like everywhere else, failing of elites, political elites in general. But here the political elites are divided in two, and this is a question. Because of the past history, because of the ethnic feuds in the past, and you know, the communist rule 25 years ago, which was more severe in many other countries, at least in Albania, the political elites are divided in two, and that is the local political elites, and the second, it is the international political elites. When I talk about international political elites, because the local one everybody has, if there were so many hands raised here on populist movement in your countries, you know, it means that you understand what failing local political elite means. But international political elite failing, meaning that there has not been enough guarantees and issued enough guarantees regarding this build-up towards democratic norms in the region in general. And I come to a point where during the last 3 or 4 years I've tried to articulate quite a lot in most of the forums that I've been in. This region normally consumes more politics that it can hold in itself. It is also historical politics as well. It is at times also quite nationalist politics as well. And this is another norm of populism in this region, because it gets a nationalist connotation, not always the democratic one, not always the plays with democracy and liberalism. It goes into nationalism quite often. So by trying to put so much emphasis on stability and security in the entire region during the last, I would say, 17 years, one has forgotten to understand that this has happened to the detriment of building a sound democracy. And this is a pattern throughout the region. When we speak about those parameters that Sławomir said about liberalism, I would say that they are democratic norms in our part of the world. Rule of law, fight against corruption, many of these other norms like the human rights issues, they are all issues that pertain democracy in our countries. But of course they come to one point together, they join together to one point where normally politicians in the region, when they really want to come up and to appeal to the mass, they turn they're back, and then they play with nationalist feelings of the region. This has been the issue during the last, I would say, 4 or 5 years, and we have seen it easily with this great love affair between the leaders in Albania and in Serbia, up to the point that you were saying, how does it come? Where did this one come from? You know, is it just the European Union or the Germans or the Americans who have encouraged the leaders to show up together and to show this great friendship between Serbs and Albanians, which is there anyway, but it is natural in itself. It doesn't need to be pampered by politicians because probably they make it worse. So they turn to these nationalistic feelings, but also to a sort of competition between leaders. And that is also a pattern of populist movements in the region as well. Regarding EU, because that was one of the touching topics. Look, many EU officials, they say today that, or also analysts, they describe today that the problem with populist movements in the region, in the Balkans, is different from the others, because here is the mainstream parties that have turned populists, rather than we having populist movements. And the only place which is interesting enough in the region where we have seen a populist movement which has turned into an anti-establishment movement has been Kosovo. During the last 4 years, 5 years, we have seen a rise of a movement which is called Vetëvendosja, that it resulted into elections, the last parliamentary elections in Kosovo, with almost 27%, which is a very large amount for a unit, for a political unit that came out as a movement and then transferred into a political party. Again, it was quite populist in all his rhetoric, and I believe that it was more of a protest vote and the way how Vetëvendosja leaders appeal to the mass and the failing political elites in Kosovo in general. But everywhere else in the region, this pattern has not gone exactly on an anti-establishment movement, not yet at least. I think that if democratic norms derail further, or if the people in the region will not be able to take their fate in their own hands and stop this populist move, or stop their leaders becoming autocratic leaders and adopt this populist rhetoric, then the situation will worsen, and we might see even everywhere else in the region anti-establishment movements. But then could be dangerous, because that could then turn into the detriment of stability and the detriment of security. And it goes as a cycle in this region. It's not like everywhere else in Europe. Now, what do Europeans do, and what should be a sort of solution, or what should the Europeans try to look at? First of all, Europeans need to be a good example as far as the Balkans are concerned. Because not only the case of Poland and Hungary, but you see nowadays even secessionist movements in the region, and you see what happens with it in Europe, and you see what happens with the secessionist movements as well. And of course the double standards of EU in general, of Brussels, regarding treatment of these movements, like it was the case in Spain. That's the first thing, is be a good example. Secondly, I think Brussels and Washington should not pamper autocratic leaders in the region to the cost of keeping the Balkans safe, because that goes to the detriment of democratic norms. And thirdly, you deal more with dysfunctional democracies, rather than you deal with matters of security and stability. And with the third element that has come nowadays, that for the last 3 or 4 years is one of the hot topic, which is the external threats to the region. There is so much discussion on that. And at the end of the day, we forget that there are certain things that is called the rule of law, or fight against corruption, or independent institutions that have been neglected for so long. At the very end, I would just like to conclude it. The general pattern of populist movements in the region, it is basically the same everywhere. I would not like to pinpoint a single country from the 6 countries in the Western Balkans now that do not have the same problems. And the expression of this populist rhetoric and this populist drive, it is absolutely the same. And at the end of the day, I would credit this to history, to the past, to transitional democracies. Democracy has not established itself, and the last one would be the role of the international community. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. Before I get to your questions, I mean, there were some reactions. So, Catherine, go ahead. You had a different interpretation of what's happening in the European Union.
Well, no, I mean, I think that I was just a little surprised to hear my friend Péter say beware. But no, I just wanted to I just wanted to make a couple of points. One is I think it ties some of the various issues that were brought up on this panel. You mentioned the local elites or national elites versus an international elite. I think that one of the hallmarks of the kinds of populist politics that we are witnessing, whether it's in this part of Europe or in different parts of Europe or even in the United States, is the populist accusation is that the national elite have more in common with their international counterparts than they do with the people that they're supposed to serve and to represent. That's one of the foundational claims of populism, that somehow once these people who claim to be of the left or of the right and so on to represent different factions get into power, they developed a separate set of interests that are more in tune with a class of international liberal politicians, and they become detached from the people that they're supposed to represent. They no longer have the best interests of their nation at heart. That's one of the accusations that comes up again and again. And I think that when I think of the UK, I was out. Do I live in a democracy? Yes, I do. But right now, I live in the worst kind of democracy. Right? I live in a democracy which is the narrowest form of democracy, majoritarian. The 52% are going to tell the 48% just exactly where to get off. Right? Now that's one version of democracy. It's the so-called will of the people. But the accusation there is that it's not about the left or about the right. It's really about the people who have been left behind by an international cosmopolitan class in the Conservative Party and in the Labour Party versus this elite. So I think that I just want to end on your point about all politics is dichotomous. I think that there's two interesting things here, is that I would say that elections are dichotomous, political arguments are dichotomous, but politics aren't necessarily dichotomous. So you can belong to a political party, and you can make your will known in terms of your wish at election time, but there's also give and take in terms of winning on some issues, losing on some other issues, because you don't just belong to one group. You belong to many groups. And I think that this is what populism does to a political landscape, is that it reduces the whole of politics to a dichotomy, as opposed to just elections to a dichotomy. And I think that that's something that we need to think about. Of course, it's going to be adversarial. Of course, there's going to be winners and losers. But what's interesting here is that what's being shown in the current political climate is that, first of all, it's not about the usual adversaries, left and right, and secondly, that it's a dichotomy that is supposed to be driven right through the political process. This is why referendums are, the order of the day. It's because basically you reduce everything to a binary issue. Welcome to what I call Colosseum politics. Thumbs up, thumbs down. I like, I don't like. I want, I don't want, right? Now, there's an element of that in elections, but it doesn't have to sum up your politics.
Thanks. Quick comment from Sławomir?
We are, I think there is a certain agreement between us, or a full agreement even. To put it in another way, it's about the dichotomy, but inside a certain limits, okay? Like, if it excludes any compromise, then actually the politics ends, okay? If the politics or democratic politics can only survive inside the liberal democracy. What Kaczynski did, he went outside the liberal democracy, okay? To put it shorter, it's good when it's left or right, it's bad when it's right or wrong, okay? And this is what we exactly have now in Poland. I would like to do like actually 3 points, quick. Okay, my first point, listen, it's very easy, I'm talking about 1989, the transition, and like all of it, that we all are together. It's quite easy to implement democracy, like democratic procedures, election procedures, and so on. It's much harder to implement liberalism, okay? To have liberal democracy, you need liberals first. And if you don't have a liberal tradition in your country, or it's very weak tradition in your country, then it's not gonna be easy to have liberal democracy, all right? You need time, you need like actually the kind of a re-education that cannot be like forced, okay, in your society. You have to really have another generation. It takes time, okay? This is why we can have some troubles with liberalism. But if Americans and Brits have some troubles, there are two fatherlands of rationalism and liberalism, then you cannot be surprised by Kaczynski or Orban, okay? Trump is even more astonishing person. My second point would be to Péter, like, tell to the Serbians, like, well, stay as, or like it's better for you if you're gonna be associated country, but it's gonna go at your expense, or it will work against your democracy if you go be inside. It's like to propose a disaster. Listen, like, first of all, why EU was established? Was it established to preserve democracy or welfare? It was not the first aim. The first aim was security, to prevent the war. It was the product of the Second World War. Just let's prevent the wars inside Europe and never have it again. This is why, especially for the region of Eastern Europe, but also for your region, Balkans. Balkans actually, it's a synonym of wars in the history of Europe. Okay, if you wanna prevent it. If you think in the long-term future, and if you remember history, what you really need here, but also in Ukraine, or in Poland, or here, is exactly the European Union, okay? The problem is that we forgot this lesson that our countries really cannot survive being not a part of the larger structure. And the best larger structure, also because of inequalities, is EU. EU is the only part of the world when inequalities are lower. Well, relatively. The inequalities are the smallest in the EU. Look at the countries outside, okay? Ukraine was a higher level, a little bit on the higher level of economy and inequalities for sure in the 1989. Look at them now. The GDP per capita is $5,000, okay? In Hungary, it's about $2,000. It's about $20,000, okay? Especially with the poverty, like per capita at least. It's even in Belarus, it's much better, okay? So, and look, if you are associated country too long, like Turkey, it produces resentment, okay? Time is important. It's only a temporary project. You cannot be associated, you cannot be in negotiations for so long. It's gonna produce resentment inside the society, inside your political elites, and so on. Well, yeah, let's say that it was my last point,
Okay.
I hope.
Thank you. Sorry to put pressure. I want to have time for questions. And Peter, let me get into your defense because otherwise we will have a debate only with the panel. No, the defense is very simple. As somebody who has been working here in the Balkans and knows, we are all born and bred on so-called Copenhagen criteria. And everybody probably here in the room will recite our, the Acquis 23rd chapter, 24th chapter, and so on. And frankly speaking, also Hungarians and Poles and all of them before 2004 could have recited the same poem. Today, in European Union, there is nothing that resembles the Copenhagen criteria. So in so many ways, and Péter, maybe I had a different argument, but let me put in this one in a way in the defense of what you were saying, is that to some extent, once when countries are inside European Union, there are no mechanisms. So that's why actually the transition process is crucial in order of sorting out democratic standards. You'll have a chance to, okay, 2 sentences, I'll count. Go ahead.
First, yeah, I think, and I underlined it pretty clear, I think it's in favor of Serbia and practically all the candidate and associate countries to join the European Union, and there are many benefits of that. But second, don't expect that the mere fact of being the member of the European Union keeps you away for the democratic problems. And for that respect, sorry, a third sentence, I do think that the pre-accession process should be used and valued pretty much, because it is the good period for institution building and for strengthening democratic norms that afterwards I think rather disappears. There is a very good study of CSIS.
That's a fourth sentence.
Okay.
That's a fourth sentence. Studies come later. Okay. Otherwise, we'll have to give him an honorary membership to the Balkan crowd. It starts with 2 sentences that are half a page long. Even Kant would envy that. Okay, your time. So, questions? If you want to give comment, 2 sentences, but real 2 sentences, not Peter's 2 sentences. Introduce yourself and ask the question. We have one over here, one over there. One over there. Okay, let's go with these first 3, 4 questions. So let's start here in the first row. Let's start with.
Hi, Sonja Stojanović, Gajić, Belgrade Center for Security Policy. First question, I would like to ask colleagues of the links between populism and captured state. So, do populists necessarily draw on capturing the state through legal means? Because my impression is that that's what's going on in Hungary and Poland, that the whole system of governance is changed through legal means, so that it's very difficult to reverse it. And if I can link to it, what happens to change the dynamics that is not visible politics, that is not politics through rhetorics, billboards and the stuff that you were describing, but that keeps the society in this momentum? And if I can add just last question, any tips on bringing resilience within society? I mean, we've seen protests on education in Hungary and in Poland, massive protests. They're encouraging, however depressive the situation might be. So any tips where these protests came from or how this can be maintained?
Thanks. Thank you for these 4 questions. We have they're all good though.
It's on. Is it working? Yeah, okay. Kurt Basiner, Democratization Policy Council in University of St. Andrews. Following on that question, because I think what you could say is that there's a populist elites are governing in the Western Balkans now. They use populism, but they're very self-contained elites and self-reinforcing, indulged by the EU and the West for stability and security. But there are many in this room, but there is a potential constituency, unserved constituency of liberals and people, proponents of liberal democracy in this region, who have not been helped by their allies. I'd like your assessment of, is there a constituency for what would amount to a liberal insurgency in the Western Balkans? And what would you, those of you within the Union, how would you say that could be best helped from without?
Thank you. Very clear. We had the third question over here and the fourth over there, and then I will get back to the panel and then another round, if we have time.
Thank you. Shpetim Gashi from the Council of Inclusive Governance. Ms. Harxhi, to illustrate my question, mentioned this Kosovo party, Vetvendosia, that I think doubled in the last election, and because of their populist rhetoric. But when we look at their rhetoric, they addressed what we call bread and butter issues: corruption, organized crime, lack of education, and they named the carriers of corruption and education, which are both in public and private sector. But they're the populist party. But how do you address these issues in an unpopulist way?
Thank you. And let's have that question, and then we get back to the panel.
Good afternoon. I'm Violeta Beširević, a professor of constitutional law in Belgrade. I have short observation and then a question for you. Short observation goes to our distinguished guest from Budapest. Being someone who is commuting between Belgrade and Budapest last 25 years and being a professor of constitutional law, I am assure you that we in Serbia also live under populist administration, but the enemy is different. The question I have for the panel is the following. Any administration, whether populist or not, is not delighted with the power of the courts to check their power. But the populist administration more directly confront with the courts when they are not under their direct control. So my question is, to what extent you think the courts are capable to resist populist administration? We have some positive example coming from the UK, when the UK Supreme Court ruled that the British government must go to Parliament first and then to begin the negotiations with the EU. And we have some also negative examples. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we have the courts resisting the populist government, how to address real problems that populists raise, but in a non-populist way. Also, you know, where is the constituency and who could be the constituency for liberal democracy, both in Balkans and outside. And then, you know, that probably is connected with the resilience, this constant campaigning, the politics of the visible, the constant campaigning mode that the populists are doing, and the link between populism and captured state. So this is the sort of the range of questions. Let's start from Edith and then go this way. Please do not feel obliged to answer all of this. Pick and choose and try to be brief in order to have maybe one more round of questions.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, populism, part of the issue of populism, it is exactly state capture. That's what we've been discussing. The idea is that they try populist movements or populist elites, when they come into control, they normally try to control the entire political spectrum, or even the independent institutions. So there is a matter of state capture. In the Balkans, if we take it into the Balkans, as I said earlier in my presentation, because the mainstream parties have turned populist, it is this case the mainstream parties who try to capture the state, and you have a state capture everywhere in the region, or almost everywhere. In my country, Albania, I've read stories about Serbia. I've read stories, of course. We have seen what has happened with Macedonia before, and most of the countries in the region. But the difference between state capture in the region, in the Balkans, and the difference between state capture anywhere else in Europe or out of Europe, during these populist periods, populist movement periods or populist elite periods, it is exactly because here there is not an established democracy. While if they can put up with some democratic values, if what Sławomir said, at the end of the day, there is there is a democracy, that there is liberalism, at the same time, that helps democracy, that has come. While in this region, the democracy per se never flourished enough. So the state capture comes, I would say it's quite feudal sometimes. The answer regarding populist elites, or where to govern, which is what Kurt asked a bit earlier, is there any group, community here that I think the only community that should be looked, and probably this goes for EU as well, if it really wants to help the region, it is youth. And I think we need to work more with youth that they do not, it is the most untouched community, but we have to be very careful by the type of education that we use today in order not to have the same elites as the previous ones. And the last one for Vedvendosia that I wanted to answer. Everybody, all populist movements, they all have the same way of talking, the same way, the same rhetoric, the same way of addressing. They all address bread and butter. That's why they're a populist movement, because it is exactly where those elites, political elites, have failed to address that they enter in, you know. And in this thing, I don't say that that's something bad, because I'm sure Goran would like to ask later on, is there anything good about populism? So the idea is, I don't see it bad if you address it, but the way is how you act at the end of the day. What would be the action that you take to, do you keep that promise? Because populists exactly come up at the time when the elites have not kept the promises. But do they keep the promises at the end of the day? I took Vedvendosia as an example to show the anti-establishment movement. Because at the end of the day, it has been a movement against establishment, and the vote has been a protest vote, despite the rhetoric that has been used. But let's see what happens afterwards. If Vedvendosia will come to power in Kosovo, then we will see how this populist movement will transfer, what will be the modality afterwards regarding how will it behave when it governs. Thank you.
Thanks.
I would like to respond to 2 points. One would be about populists on government. I think that the usual, let's say, rule is that populists in government are go to failure. So populism is something that usually works way better from opposition than from government, because you have to deliver on government and it's not so easy. And what the populists see usually is that the reason why it's not so easy to deliver are the institutional checks and balances. Therefore, and sometimes state capture is a tool for that, they try to weaken the checks and balances, and paradoxically, it can lead sometimes to good output results of populist governance. I mean, perceived by the people. For example, in Hungary, there was a retroactive measure of the government that took back some of the benefits that state leaders received beforehand, 98% of these benefits. It was practically unconstitutional, and practically they changed the constitution with the 2/3 and then passed it away. And I mean, this kind of a tool that you go against the institution for the people, if you can do it wise, then it can give you a huge credibility. And this is the thing in Hungary. And paradoxically, state capture, I mean, because it leads to, in a lot of cases, if it's state captured by government close interest, to bigger centralization and sometimes more efficient policy making. And that's why I think there is a model right now in Central Eastern Europe to shift more from a populism is rhetoric to a populism is action model, which brings it a bit closer, I would say, to populisms in even Central and Southern America, that you have to deliver, because otherwise, as previous examples, first law and justice government, for example, have proved it can easily collapse. And the other point would be on the comparison between Budapest or Hungary and Serbia. I'm not saying at all that Serbia does not have any populist challenges. I just made a few comparisons where I see that because of this, let's say, external pressures that the wannabe EU membership put on the countries, the elites usually behave better in the period where they want to join the European Union, and I see some signs of that in Serbia. And one paradoxically, there's one good example about how the courts resist in Hungary as well. What we can see in Hungary, for example, is that that the prosecutor's office is practically the extended hand of the government that lost all its independence, but the courts, in most of the cases, just follow their own rules, and attempts to totally replace the courts with loyalists have practically failed. And at that point, the EU had a very important role, for example, not to blame the EU for everything.
Thanks. Catherine?
Just two quick points. One is that I'd like to link your question about the courts and your question about how to address some of these issues that are legitimate in non-populist ways. And I think that, you know, the British case gives us a clue here, which is that one of the things that the Supreme Court did is, you know, to use a sports metaphor, they played the game, not the ball, right? They basically defended a process of politics. And I think that this is one of the things that we have to be able to do, those of us who don't count ourselves as populist, which is defend the process, which I think is a terribly difficult and hugely unsexy thing to do in the current times. Nobody wants to talk about the process of politics. Everybody wants to talk about their opinion. They want to talk about the quick solution. This is why most people stay in their own social media silos, because, you know, you just have to agree with each other on what the simple solution might be on either side of the fence. Whereas I think that we've become very, very bad at talking about process, right? We've used technocracy as a substitute to talk about the political process, right? Which is why technocracy and expertise have now got, you know, such bad press. But if technocracy and expertise are at the service of a political process, then it can be extremely powerful and extremely convincing. I think the issue is that we've really become terribly bad at doing this in a way that is compelling for people. I mean, the minute I said the word political process, I could see half of you, your eyes rolled into your head, right? Because it's the sort of, you know, it's like when somebody turns up on your doorstep and gives you statistics, right? But this is not what we're talking about. And this is what I meant about saying about getting a little bit more creative, because the way in which to address legitimate grievances that the populists verbalize in non-populist ways is to focus on the value of, you know, a certain political process. But we need to be much, much better at it. And I just want to say one last thing on the issue of bread and butter issues, which is that one of the things that populist parties have been very good at, and I think that non-populist mainstream parties have fallen into this trap, is that they're very good at switching sides. So on the one hand, it's bread and butter issues. It's all about wages. It's all about no longer being able to afford, you know, what my parents might have been able to afford, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when whatever government is in power says, okay, well, we'll address the wages, we'll address certain things, the comeback is, it's not about wages, it's not about the money, it's about our culture. Right? And so then all of a sudden it flips and it becomes all about, you know, our identity. It's not the fact that I don't have enough money, it's the fact that I don't recognize the street where I live, for example, right? Or nobody on the bus seems to speak the same language as myself. And the fact that, you know, they switch from one to the other. Now, sometimes they get caught. If you take somebody like Marine Le Pen actually lost very big on the euro. Right? She got completely overtaken by the fact that actually her electorate was very worried about leaving the euro. And if you dug your heels in on that, you know, from an economic perspective, people actually got scared. But it was a last-minute thing. You know, the rest of the campaign was an identity campaign. So I think it's, you know, you're right to bring up the bread and butter issues, but I think, you know, one of the things that makes it very tricky to counter is that, you know, 1 minute it's about wages, next minute it's about, you know, our identity. And of course, we know that these things are inseparable.
Thanks. Sławomir?
The question about protests, where do they lead, which is a very interesting question, and there is a very interesting paradox, actually. First reservation, they're not so big, unfortunately. In Hungary they were bigger In Hungary, 2011, you had 300,000 people on the streets when there was a law about media to be passed. And it didn't change anything, actually, or at least it didn't change much. In Poland, 300,000 at least never happened. And, you know, we are 40 million people population. So if we have like, let's say, the 100,000 people on the street, and politicians, especially such tough politicians like Kaczynski, you know, they can count. They know that 8 million people elected him. So if there is 100,000 people, there's nothing that he can be really scared about. And actually he can use it saying like, listen, these are the traitors, you know, let me defend you, because those guys immediately will, you know, take back the social transfers I already offered you. So it's really not, but the paradox actually is different. You know what's the direct consequences of it, at least as for now? Well, in the question of abortion, they prevented Kaczynski to ban it totally. So only women were efficient. Only women really pushed him back. This is the only case for last too long. Exactly the same thing happened in USA. So what we have now, and this is the only social group that it's really really tough to populists, because if you look at what is really the antithesis to populism, to the global populism, is feminism. This is what populists hate everywhere in the world. And if you would take the Marxist definition of the revolutionary class, which class is really pauperized, which class really pay biggest costs and so on, there are women everywhere. And actually this is a good social group to resist populists. They are everywhere. Usually they have majority, they are very well educated, they are much more tough. They are similar in populists in a sense that they feel no shame when it comes to the streets. Usually, you know, liberals and like all those manifestations are like, let's go to the street, but come on, we have a distance to the ideas, let's have some fun at the same time. And on the other side, they have an army of tough, angry people, okay? And the populists, if you look at the people who are behind Kaczynski, they are really tough guys, okay? And the only tough opposition to them on the street are women. They don't scare. I mean, the rest are like, it's like really quite easygoing liberal, usually guys who don't really care much, at least the same much as women. So this is one thing, but again, it's not the paradox. This is quite obvious to me. But the paradox is that when we have people on the street, usually what happens is the opposition goes down in the public polls. Why? Because in the same time, when people go to the streets, people who support them, they think in the anti-partisan way. And they invest all the expectations to the protesters. They think that, but the protesters cannot win election. The parties win election, okay? So when people go to the streets, opposition party are getting to be weak, because what are the people talking about in the streets? Kaczynski is bad, but the liberal parties and the oppositional parties are so disappointing as well, okay? So they don't, this is a paradox, like we have to do something with this.
Thanks. Actually, let me start with what you mentioned as a paradox, because actually I don't think it's a paradox. I think it's a state of politics, and that state of politics in many of the countries in Western Europe and the Western Balkans is also not far away from that, actually has been there, is that the mainstream political parties have been simply bad, have been not delivering. So you have a democracy, and then inside the democracy, the key parties were supposed to deliver. Now, there are claims which are not about the delivery, but also there are legitimate issues that have been invoked that have been about delivery, and that was a failed delivery. And I think one of the issues, I think Sławomir, you pointed out the most vividly with the 500 zloty, with the social welfare system in Poland, is that actually, you know, guys, did you do it or you didn't do it? You had a choice. You had the money in your budget. you chose not to do it. So you have to live with the consequences. And I think one of the issues there is also to admit a mistake and then move on. Now, one of the things that Catherine mentioned is that there is a very essential problem in the way how politics is conducted today. You were talking about the, are you basically, you know, are there rules that will allow me to admit a mistake and then rebuild? And I think what you're pointing out that in these rules of politics, where actually everything is up for grabs, including the rules themselves, there is no space to admit mistakes. The second thing is as well the media cycle, because it went into very short-termism, and everybody is into winning the battle of the day, and very few will actually focus on the vision of the future. And actually, for that matter, some of those parties that we label as populists are having vision of the future. Interestingly enough, even they're opportunists in the daily dealing. But I think it's very important to admit the mistakes, and especially, one of the things that I constantly see that a lot of mainstream political parties forgot is the localities, the small places. They simply went way too up and then they forgot. And then when you see when mainstream movements and parties win elections, what do? Actually, they do not forget their voters. They go and they talk to them door to door. I mean, Hollande's election in France was a good example. Second issue is, and this is my random sort of list to conclude the discussion, and please pay very good attention to this. This is the second issue. Who here is liberal? Plenty. Take your wallets. Take your wallets. Open them and start spending for what you believe, because the conservatives are doing exactly that. And I think that's really important, because one thing that unites a lot of liberals is the fact how they expect somebody else to foot the bill. Be that the state, the party, the businesses, never us. And I think that's really crucial, because actually Sławomir was talking something that I conceptually fully agree with, which was like, have a stake, have an emotion. You know, the feminists have a real stake. They have an emotion and they go there. And by the way, no surprise that strong women will defend democracy. I think that's probably our only chance. And I say that fully conscious of who am I, and I belong to the other sex. But seriously, one has to say this. We don't have media. Who will pay for that media? You know, Oko in Poland, is that a good outlet? Will there be 10,000 Polish people who will pay 2 beers a month, which will actually maintain this outlet fully independent, fully functioning? In Hungary, Atlazo, one of the most active anti-corruption portals, they try to have 4,000 people as regular monthly subscribers to them and supporters. The price was €3 a month, which liberals will sip in one cafe latte. Yes, thank you. I was wondering whether there's a price of cafe latte or an option. But I think it's important. Actually, we have to start thinking in very practical sense. And I have to say in this, the best lesson to learn is from the conservative camp, because they've been very active, they've been touching their wallets, and they've been actually very committed in what they believe. Now, the third thing, and actually I have to say, to me, it was really interesting debate. I don't have an answer to that. Debate about where the populism really slides in a way from something which makes a society authoritarian. And I had an aha moment when I read the OSCE report, the monitoring report after Hungarian elections. I really recommend you to read. I had an aha moment because I come from Macedonia. I read this report. It could have been comfortably written for Macedonian elections in 2014. Comfortably. Because the election says, you know what? They were free on the day of the election, but everything else was bad, and everything else actually led to an unfair advantage. And I think, again, to my understanding, when these rules of elections in particular, but not on elections, when the media, when at this moment, Marika Neni, which means Grandma Neni, in rural Hungary, cannot get any other voice than the state TV that says migrants are coming to rape you, and she starts believing after 100 times having heard this, we have a problem of whether in that environment you could have actually fair elections. And I think this is something where, you know, one has to act against the populists. I close on the really confident note about feminism as a counter action to populism. I have not thought about this, Sławomir. I also close on the actually to defend the process of politics. I think, Catherine, that was really, really, really important to think, and even if it's abstract, I think we have to fight, because the good politics means that political parties can agree what are the rules of the game, and then afterwards compete. Péter mentioned, you know, he was very sort of doom and gloom about Hungary, but he also mentioned one really, really positive point, which are Hungarian courts, and that's sort of the last bastion that is happening there. And I think, you know, if people see in their real life that the court defends those that are actually the weaker, that makes a point of why democracy has actually a value. And Edith, one thing that I take from you is actually we really have to look at the mainstream parties, and we have to really identify what's populist about them and start telling and sort of weed it out. Because I think in the Balkans, if this is not happening, then everything will become mushy and everything will become in this relatively inexact category. I did not steal a single minute of your time since you came here at 4:06, and I hope this was a good and inspiring panel, and I hope the next 24 minutes you will use for networking, because, you know, coffee breaks at conferences like this have this second important function. Thank you very much to all the panelists. Give them a hand.